everyone, and welcome back to this introduction on floral carving. I'm Joe Meling for Weaver Leathercraft, and I'd like to thank you for following along. If you're just joining us now, you can go back, get your free downloadable pattern, and check out the last videos. We've been working through each tool, starting from the very beginning and moving along there. So today we're going to start working with our Pear Shader and bringing some definition within the flowers and within the leaves themselves. Let's head over to the marble and get started. In the original tool video, we talked about two different Pear Shaders. First, our larger one that came with the kit, and that's got a little smoother face to it. And then the other one was a small Pear Shader that I recommend adding on. This one has a little smaller face, but the checkers are a little deeper in there. And that's the Pear Shader that I'm going to use today as we go to tool on this pattern that we got started for our journal. Now, I'm going to run that Pear Shader in a couple different ways. First off, on these leaves, I'm going to use that kind of in place of a leaf liner. And I'm going to lightly tap right along the vein of those leaves. Now, anytime I'm running that Pear Shader, I'm not holding it straight up and down and hitting that straight down. I'll be tipping it one way or the other. When I have that straight up and down, you get the full tool imprint. And I don't want the entire imprint there. I want to be able to tip that and have it fade out. So out here in these ridges, I'll show you where I will hit a little harder, have a little more pressure down there to get some of that darker shadowing. And that's actually a burnishing effect. So that's having your moisture right in your leather and being able to run that down there. Now you'll see as I come down that stem, you can hear the difference as I tap that tool and fade that out. I'll go back and soften those edges up. So I'm going to come down along the stem of this leaf here as well. Get the bottom side of that. Now, just like when we ran the bevel, I'm wanting to avoid having too many choppy lines in there, right? And that's why you'll hear me fade that back across there. Okay, now let's keep working right through the pattern here with some of this vine work. And hear how that starts out hitting pretty hard. And then I'll reduce the pressure and fade that back down there. Soften those lines up. Okay, this little stump that we have down here, I'm going to use this in a few different spots. One right here on that bottom petal. You can see how the face of that is a little big for that particular piece. So I can turn that around, use the narrow end of that tool and tip it back a little bit to get the versatility to fit in those smaller spaces. That's one reason I really like this smaller tool, just for that versatility. As you can tell already, I run that tool more like I would run a bevel down something. So as far as the bigger spaces go, I have no problem filling those up with the smaller tool. Okay. Now as I get into this flower, we're gonna start really getting some definition in those petals by putting some ridges in there with this pear shader. So everywhere there's a bump out on the end here is where I'm going to be using that pear shader. It's a great starting point. Now as I create these ridges, keep in mind that you're wanting them all to point back towards that flower center. I'm going to fade those lines back down so that coloring's going down there, and it's going to start creating a little bit of depth in those petals. This is the kind of the foundation tool that starts that, and then we'll pick that up more when we come back in with decorative cuts. Work our way around this flower here. Getting those ridges put out there. So just looking at the difference between those petals, you can start to really see some definition coming in there with the pear shader. Now watch as I come rolling around here, I'll be tipping my tool back away from that point to keep that toe out of there, not get that sharp line down the front of that. Then also as I'm coming out this way, I'll start tipping that tool back to avoid getting a nice sharp line down there as well. We're almost pushing leather towards that center of the petal, which is going to help create those ridges in there. Now we want to be careful. I'm going back and I'm softening those edges coming down into that petal, but I don't want to get too carried away with the pear shader and just shade in the whole thing, right? And make a big divot out of that entire flower petal. Otherwise it really loses the effect. So by just having it within those ridges and out on the ends, we're starting to actually create some depth in there and starting to get some flow in there, so when we come back with our decorative cuts, we can really bring those petals to life. Okay, now the flower stem, the one that's actually feeding into that flower, I'm not going to use a pear shader on. I'll leave that one out for now. We're going to come along the rest of this vine work up here as we work our way up towards the top of the pattern. Okay, another big key on this is look how close to the edge I'm running that tool out. Now, I'm gonna almost create a small ridge right on the edge of that vine work. Right up there by bringing that pear shader out close to the edge. You can see here on the flower where we come around those petals and got right out next to the edge. Now let me show you the difference if we keep that held back and started back a ways. Even softening the edges and running that back. See the difference that looks? It definitely looks like tool marks in there, not natural flow to it. So I'm going to recognize that and go back and fix that there, because this is something we can take more time on and go back and fix as we're going here. I'm going to run that out a little closer to the end. Soften that edge. Continue to run it down there. Okay, now that little edge up there creates kind of a highlight on the edge of that petal, and we got a nice canvas to come back in and put decorative cuts in. Come back up to this leaf, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to highlight that stem with a little bit of shadowing in here. And then working right out on the edge of those ridges. I think fading that down and softening the edge as we go. Come around on the inside, do that same thing on this side of that leaf. And just like when we were doing the bevel, take the time you need, right? Don't get in a hurry. Be patient with yourself. Take the time to come back and smooth those out as much as possible. I'm going to switch here where we have this kind of this point coming up and then a fatter part down there at the bottom. I'm going to use my smaller point on my pear shader. Run that right up there towards the top. Fade that out, soften those lines. And then I'm going to start down here with the wide end. And then fade up nice and easy. You can see that started creating that ridge right up the center of that stump. Again, it's just an extra little highlight that you can add simply by fading that pear shader around. Just a few more spots here. This tool here, you can really tell your moisture content in your leather and make sure that's still doing good. You can tell when I start those out at the end there where I'm hitting down pretty hard, we're getting a really nice burnish in there. And that means that leather's showing that darker color. It's going to help get some of that natural coloring in your project before you even add any finish to it. Now if you were hitting down pretty hard and it was still fairly light, like it is down here towards where I'm fading, then you might know that your leather's getting a little dry and it would need to be wet down a little bit more. Okay, now up here at the top of this pattern, we got kind of two ridges on that blade there. I'm going to treat that just like I would these ridges on the flower petals or the leaves. We're going to get right out there next to that edge. Fade it down, that first one, soften the edges. Okay. Down there to the bottom one. Same thing, fade it down, soften the edges, but getting right out there towards the edge. So Pear Shader definitely takes a lot of practice, but it's a tool that can really add to your project and help bring that to life and start giving you some of that definition before we get our final tools in there. Thank you once again for following along with this introduction to floral carving. I hope you're finding value in what we're doing here, and invite you to check out our next videos as we start going through the details and finishing out this pattern that we're working on. So remember, be patient as you're learning and have fun with what you're doing.